Hi, Anirudh. Today we have with us Anirudh Burman, who's a research fellow at Carnegie India and works on land and urbanization. So he's going to share his big idea for India and emerging markets today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, you can begin with your
Okay.
yeah.
So the idea that I want to discuss with you is about looking at how globalization is affecting Indian cities and how that in turn is actually going to impact the way we think about planning Indian cities. Uh, because the way market forces are operating in India, due to the global economic forces that have increasingly come into shape the way cities work, it is not possible for our urban planning to take place in the way that we've traditionally thought about. And I'm willing to expand that
Right.
in more detail now. Yeah.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about what is the context in which Indian cities evolved and how has that changed now because of globalization?
Sure. So, as you know, we had a more or less centralized planning economy until, say, the early 90s when the economy was liberalized. And that in turn gave our central planners and the urban planners the ability to plan cities in a different way, which was much more top down. And we had these concepts of master plans for at least the major Indian cities, where a 20-year plan for the development of the city would be put forward by urban planners. And the city, at least in theory, was supposed to be designed according to the plan. So they would say, for example, that for every 100,000 people, we need a kind of a shopping center, we need two hospitals, some schools. This is where the school will be located, this is where the hospital will be located, the shopping center will be here. Everything has to be within like a 15-minute distance from the residential area and so on. Now, that worked well when cities were evolving slowly because that kind of plan was also implemented slowly over a period of time. But even in the early periods of uh, of our independence, when we were looking at how cities were developing in the pre 1991 era, we saw that this was not really working out in practice because the way the plan was being implemented was too small or too slow, and that was inadequate for the volume of population growth that was taking place in these cities. And after 1991, that dynamic has changed completely.
Right. So, do you think this is a problem that only affects bigger cities like Mumbai and Delhi, or do you think this is a problem that exists in tier two, tier three cities, or even cities that are considered well planned like Bhubaneswar or Chandigarh?
So let's take a step back and think about what cities are. And cities are basically labor markets. They're basically places where people come to work together. And because they have their own degrees of specialization, they complement each other. And that's how cities become more productive over a period of time. So the benefit of having a city is basically this close agglomeration of people with different skills, perspectives, and so on that helps create a local economy that in turn produces goods and services more efficiently than, say, in a rural area where people don't cluster together in the same way. Right? So globalization tends to affect this in different ways for different kinds of cities. So, for example, some cities have specializations in how they operate. For example, Bangalore and Hyderabad you would think of as primarily IT services cities. Right? So, they would be impacted by the degree to which there is a demand for IT related services globally and the degree to which the labor pool in Bangalore and Hyderabad can actually service that demand. Right? Similarly, Bombay or Mumbai is basically a city which has expertise or significant skills in BFSI kind of
Yes,
services. So the demand that shapes Bombay is determined by the global demand for
that
skills
service.
for that service. Right? And this affects big and small cities differently. So, for example, there are smaller cities in the southern parts of the country that service very niche markets globally. For example, Udupi in Karnataka uh, has an expertise in building fishing nets and fishing products that are in great demand in Japan.
Right.
Right? So, and that's a global economic force that is in turn shaping the dynamics of Udupi as it is working right now. Right? So, it has differential impacts. On the other hand, we also see a very different scale of impact depending on how big or how complex that city already is. So, for example, there is now increasing research to show that global financial centers like London and
Hmm.
Singapore, they their housing prices and real estate prices are actually synchronized to each other rather than their local markets.
Right.
Right? And this is because the kind of economic activity that is generated in these cities speaks more to each other
Each
rather
other.
than to their domestic market.
Hmm.
Right? So these are the ways in which globalization tends to affect cities differently.
Right. I think I have another question here. That how do you plan cities when we are expanding existing cities and setting up new cities? If you see, Gandhinagar is fairly new as compared to Ahmedabad, which was an older city. When we're coming up with these new urban centers, how do we account for global economic forces?
Well, I think one problem that we face increasingly is that when we are planning for new cities, it is becoming increasingly harder to do the kind of intensive planning that I was talking about, where you basically make a projection about what the population is going to be like 20 years from now and decide how many hospitals and commercial centers and how much office space you need now. Because that's not going to be possible
Hmm.
anymore. Just because global economic forces are harder to account for when you're projecting 20 years in the future. If you're
Hmm.
part of a global market and you're subject to a global economy, you never know what skills are going to be in demand. So, for example, 20 years ago, no one would have predicted that there would be such demand for BPO related
Hmm.
labor in tier 2 cities in India. Right? But now we have an entire market for these services in tier 2 cities. When COVID broke out, we saw increasingly that even accounting firms are now opening branch offices in smaller Indian
Hmm.
cities. And then that creates its own local economy. It drives up demand for, say, commercial real estate in a smaller city. So it becomes much harder to do the kind of planning that we were doing earlier, which is you say, okay, this is a small city, it's going to grow by this much over 20
You'll
years.
project
You
population. You'll
pro-
project some things, but
exactly.
you can't. You're not an oracle. You can't see the future.
Exactly. So you can't you definitely can't project 20 years in the future. And even more short term projections are going to be difficult,
Hmm.
which means planning has to become much more attuned to the economy and the economic potential of the city in a global context. And it also has to be more minimal, it has to be more focused around providing essential infrastructure and letting the market actually provide a lot of the services that or the urban amenities that we think urban planning should have provided for.
Right. So, because you're a lawyer, first I have a question related to the law, which is how, what role do you think can legal changes play in enabling planners to make such choices? What are some things that you would like to see change within the law?
Well, most of our planning is actually determined or set in stone in our laws and regulations and bylaws. And a lot of these actually restrict cities from developing organically. For example, there are limits on how high you can build buildings, there are limits on what kind of commercial activities permitted in which part of the city, right? And in many cases, this actually runs contrary to the economic logic of that city, right? So, for example, if you have a cluster of people who are good in IT services and who are living in a particular area, they would prefer to have an office
In
close
that
to that
area, yeah.
area. But if your zoning laws and your uh, other land use laws prevent you from having an office complex in that city, in that neighborhood, you're basically going to then force them to travel 1 hour, 1.5 hours every day to an office complex, which is uneconomic. It is inefficient because you're not making optimal use of the labor pool that is in that locality.
Right.
So we need to basically completely redo our planning laws, our zoning restrictions, and so on, to make this kind of economic efficiency arising from the market dynamics much more possible and organic.
Right. So, thank you so much, Anirudh, for talking to us about how much the world has changed since our initial conceptions of urban planning, and how much we need to change our mind about how urban planning should look. So, thank you for your time.
Thank you.